All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep into the thought of Syrianus.
Ooh, Syrianus, a fascinating figure.
He's a philosopher from the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE. And the main source we're using for this deep dive is his entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Perfect source. And for our listeners out there, you're all philosophically inclined. You want the info. You want it fast, but you don't want to get bogged down. We get it. That's why we've designed this deep dive to really highlight Syrianus's importance without, overwhelming you. We want to get to the core of his contributions.
Absolutely. So to kind of kick things off, who was Syrianus? Like the elevator pitch?
Sure. So in a nutshell, Syrianus was a teacher of philosophy.
Okay.
Probably rhetoric, too, actually. He was active in Athens.
Athens, yeah. Big philosophical hub.
Exactly. And he succeeded Plutarch as head of the Athenian school.
Whoa, big shoes to fill.
Huge shoes. And then, of course, he was the teacher of, the one and only Proclus.
Oh, wow. Proclus, that's a whole other deep dive.
Another deep dive for another day, yeah.
Yeah.
Syrianus lived roughly from the second half of the 4th century to 437 CE. So he was a contemporary of Augustine of Hippo.
Interesting. Same era, very different contexts.
Right. And we only really have, of his copious work, his commentaries on parts of Aristotle's metaphysics. And maybe possibly some stuff on Hermogenes.
Okay, so limited sources, but still enough to give us a picture.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And, as a philosopher yourself, you know the importance of context, right?
Oh, absolutely. Can't separate the ideas from the time and place they emerged.
Exactly. So Syrianus lived through some seriously dramatic changes in the Roman Empire. I mean, think about it. We're talking the rise of Christianity as the state religion, Gothic tribes making incursions all over. This wasn't just background noise. It profoundly shaped the intellectual currents of the time, the very questions that philosophers like Syrianus were wrestling with.
It makes you wonder, how did they even find time to think with all that going on?
Right. And that's why this context is vital. It helps us understand where Syrianus's philosophy fits in, what he was responding to.
Makes sense. So let's dive into his life. Where do we even start?
Well, Damascus, a later Neoplatonist, gives us a pretty vivid picture.
Okay, lay it on us.
He says Syrianus was strikingly handsome, tall too, and obviously incredibly intelligent.
So the total package, brains and beauty.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Okay, but where did he come from? What was his background?
She was originally from Alexandria.
Alexandria, another intellectual hotbed.
Absolutely. But he moved to Athens to study under Plutarch. Not the Plutarch, the biographer.
Right. Different Plutarch, the philosopher.
Yes, exactly. And it's fascinating to compare the intellectual vibes of Alexandria and Athens at that time. Alexandria was this hub of, intense debate, especially between pagan and Christian intellectuals. I mean, the story of Hypatia is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, a stark reminder of the tensions of that era.
But then you have Athens. It was experiencing a real revival of Plato's academy, a return to its philosophical roots. Two very different intellectual climates.
It makes you wonder how Syrianus navigated those two worlds. Alexandria, Athens.
Yeah.
It must have shaped his thinking in some way.
No doubt. And what's interesting? Archaeologically speaking, it seems like Syrianus, Plutarch, and even later Proclus.
Yeah.
They weren't teaching at the original site of Plato's academy.
Really? I always pictured them, under the olive trees debating the forms.
Nope. The evidence suggests they were actually based near the Theater of Dionysus, right in the heart of Athens.
That's so interesting. It really brings them down to earth, Not literally, of course, but...
Yeah. It humanizes them. Reminds us they weren't just abstract figures, but real people living in a real city.
Right. And speaking of real-world stuff, we can't ignore the challenges that pagan intellectuals faced as Christianity became more and more dominant.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Theodosius making Christianity the state religion. That was a game changer.
Yeah, talk about shifting sands.
And then, in 425 CE, Theodosius II founded the University of Constantinople, an imperial university. You can imagine the impact that had on independent schools like the Athenian school.
Must have been tough to compete.
For sure. Their survival really depended on the brilliance and dedication of their individual members, people like Syrianus.
And this is where Proclus enters the scene, right?
Exactly. In 431 CE, Proclus shows up in Athens. And according to Marinus, Syrianus was initially pretty suspicious of him.
Really? Why?
It's not totally clear. Maybe he thought Proclus was spy or something.
Oh, wow. Like an intellectual spy.
Maybe. But then the story goes, Syrianus saw Proclus openly participating in traditional pagan rituals.
And that changed his mind.
It did. He saw Proclus's genuine commitment to the old ways and decided to take him on as a student.
Talk about a test of faith. Literally.
And of course, Proclus ended up becoming his successor, the heir apparent. Syrianus also had another brilliant student, Domnanus, who was Jewish. He eventually went back to his hometown, Larissa.
Okay, so a diverse group of students. It seems like Syrianus was open to talent, regardless of background.
Yeah, it seems that way. And Marinus gives us some great insights into Syrianus' teaching style, too.
Oh, tell me more. What was he like as a teacher?
Well, apparently he was very rigorous, much more so than Plutarch. He put Proclus through the ringer, you know.
Really? What kind of ringer are we talking about?
Well, they went through the entire Aristotelian corpus together. Logic, ethics, politics, physics, theology, the whole shebang.
Wow, that's like a philosophical boot camp.
Exactly. And all of that was just preparation before they even touched Plato.
Wow. So Aristotle as a stepping stone to Plato.
In a way, yes. But it's important to note, it wasn't because Syrianus thought Aristotle and Plato were saying the same things. He just saw Aristotle's work as a really strong foundation, a way to train the mind for the complexities of Platonic thought.
Ah, so it's about developing a certain kind of intellectual discipline, a way of thinking.
Right. And then on top of Plato, they also studied the Orphic poems and the Chaldean oracles.
Whoa, things are getting mystical.
Yeah, a little bit. But that just shows how interconnected different intellectual strands were in late antiquity.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these lost works of Syrianus. Commentaries, treatises, oracles. It sounds like there's a whole hidden library out there.
Right. It's amazing to think about. And it's frustrating, too, because we lost so much. The Suda, that 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, it attributes all kinds of works to Syrianus. Commentaries on Homer, a commentary on Plato's Republic, stuff on the theology of Orpheus, even a 10-book treatise on the agreement between Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato when it comes to oracles.
Okay, 10 books on that. That's some serious dedication.
Right. But of course, as with anything from that era, you have to be careful about attributing and verifying these works. We don't have all the pieces.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. But even just the titles of these works and the few fragments we have, they give us a glimpse into the breadth of Syrianus' intellectual interests. You know, it was very common for Platonic philosophers of his time to engage deeply with these kinds of texts. Homer, Orpheus, the Chaldean oracles. They saw them as containing hidden philosophical and theological truths.
It makes you realize how differently they approached knowledge back then. It wasn't just about logic and reason, but also about myth and symbolism.
Absolutely. They saw different paths to truth. And the fact that Syrianus actually taught a course on the Chaldean oracles shortly before he died, that says a lot about his commitment to these traditions.
Yeah, it's not just some side interest. It's part of his core philosophical project.
Right. And, you know, later Neoplatonists, like Isidore and Damascus, they held Syrianus' commentaries in very high regard, even though most of them are lost. We have these tantalizing references.
It's like knowing there's a treasure out there, but not being able to find the map.
And it's not just the later Neoplatonists. R.L. Cardulo, a modern scholar, he's done some great work arguing that Syrianus probably wrote commentaries on a whole bunch of Aristotle's works, not just the metaphysics.
Oh, wow. So even more lost treasures.
Yeah, it's crazy. And he probably wrote on Plato's Timaeus and Parmenides, too.
Man, it makes you wonder what insights we're missing out on.
Absolutely. And it also raises another interesting question, right? What form did these commentaries take? Were they super polished treatises meant for publication? Or were they more like, you know, informal lecture notes that circulated among his students?
Yeah, good point. It's hard to know for sure.
Right. And then there's the question of influence. It's hard to gauge Syrianus' direct influence because we've lost so much of his work, but his impact is undeniable, especially through his students.
Yeah, Hermias of Alexandria and Proclus, two giants in their own right.
Exactly. Hermias' lectures on Plato's Phaedrus, they almost certainly draw on Syrianus' teachings, even if he doesn't explicitly mention them.
That was common back then, right? Not always citing your sources.
Yeah, pretty common. But Proclus, he's different. He openly acknowledges his debt to Syrianus. And I mean, Proclus was a synthesizer, right? He systematized the whole of Platonism.
Yeah, he's like the ultimate Platonist compiler.
Right. And it's very likely that many of the core ideas Proclus developed, he got them from Syrianus. He's building on that foundation.
So even though we've lost a lot of Syrianus's work, His ideas are still alive and kicking in Proclus's writings. It's like a philosophical echo.
Precisely. And there's actually a pretty clear line of transmission for Syrianus's commentary on the metaphysics. We know it was being used in Alexandria several generations after he died.
Oh, how do we know that?
Well, later commentators, like Asclepius of Tralles, they clearly knew it. And if the commentary attributed to Phoeus Alexander is actually by Michael of Ephesus, as many scholars now think,
Yeah.
then it means Syrianus's interpretations were also available in Constantinople in the 12th century.
Wow, so his ideas traveled far and wide.
They did. And there was even a Latin translation of his commentary in 1558. So his influence, though fragmented, it had a surprisingly long reach.
Speaking of which, let's finally talk about the work that has survived, the commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics.
Ah, yes. We have his commentary on books 3, 4, and 33, 4.
Those are some key books covering some pretty fundamental metaphysical questions.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that we have around 18 manuscripts of this commentary.
That's pretty good for a text from that era.
It is. But
Yeah.
it's important to remember this isn't like one unified, comprehensive interpretation of the metaphysics. It's more like 3 separate essays, each with its own focus and style.
Okay, so like 3 mini treatises within a larger commentary.
Yeah, something like that. The first essay is on Book Beta, which is all about the logical difficulties and topics that lead discussion in metaphysics, what Aristotle calls aporia.
Basically all the big questions that keep philosophers up at night.
Yeah. And the Stanford entry points out that this essay starts really abruptly, like there's barely any introduction.
Really? Just dives right in.
Pretty much. But what's really interesting is Syrianus's approach. He's not primarily concerned with how Aristotle himself resolves these problems later in the metaphysics.
Oh, so he's not just doing a close reading of the text.
Not exactly. He's more interested in how he thinks, as a Platonist, these problems should be resolved.
Ah, so he's engaging with Aristotle, but also offering his own distinct perspective.
Precisely. It's a critical engagement.
Eh.
And then we have a second essay, which is on Book Gamma. It's much shorter, and it deals with the concept of being in general and the law of non-contradiction.
Okay, those are pretty fundamental concepts.
They are. And Syrianus actually says he keeps it brief because Alexander of Aphrodisias already wrote a really good commentary on this book.
So he's aware of the existing scholarship and not afraid to defer to others when he thinks it's warranted.
Yeah, I think that's a mark of a good philosopher. Knowing what's already been said and not just trying to reinvent the wheel.
Right. And then we come to the third essay, which is on books Mu and Nu. This one is super interesting because it's all about Syrianus defending Platonism and Pythagoreanism against Aristotle's criticisms.
Yeah, this is where he really gets into the philosophical nitty-gritty. And what's cool is that in the introduction to this essay, he explicitly praises Aristotle.
Oh, so it's not just a takedown.
No, not at all. He admires Aristotle's logic, his ethics, his physics. He even likes Aristotle's view of forms in matter, his emphasis on definitions, and his ideas about divine causal principles.
Wow, so it's a nuanced position. He's recognizing Aristotle's contributions, but also pushing back where he disagrees.
Exactly. And the main point of disagreement is Aristotle's critique of Pythagorean and Platonic first principles, especially in books 13th and 14th of the Metaphysics. Syrianus' argument is that Aristotle just doesn't get it. He either misunderstands or misrepresents their core ideas.
So it's like a philosophical clash of titans. Aristotle versus Plato, round 2.
Yeah, kind of. And for you as a philosopher, I think the stakes here are pretty high. Both later Platonists and Orthodox Christians, they were both committed to the idea of a single ultimate principle. This was in direct contrast to the Gnostics, who had a dualistic view of the cosmos.
Right. Gnosticism with its good God and evil God.
Exactly. So Platonists and Christians, they found common ground in this idea of a transcendent first principle. But they differed on things like the creation of the cosmos and whether it's eternal or not.
Okay, so lots of nuance there.
Tons of nuance. And then you have the whole Platonist view of being with its hierarchical structure. You have the immaterial first principles, the forms, the divine souls, the logoi, this whole complex system.
It sounds like a very intricate philosophical architecture.
It is. And one of the big challenges for Platonists was explaining how unity gives rise to diversity. How do you get from the one to the many?
Yeah, that's a head scratcher.
It is. And their solution, or at least part of it, was the idea of the monad and the dyad. The monad representing unity and the dyad representing multiplicity or difference.
Okay, so like 2 fundamental principles that interact to create the cosmos.
Exactly. And Aristotle in the Metaphysics, he really pushes back against this whole Platonic scheme. He doesn't buy the idea of ideal numbers and forms as fundamental substances. He thinks they're just abstractions from the physical world.
So for Aristotle, it's all about the material world as the primary reality.
Right. And Syrianus steps into this debate and offers a robust defense of Platonism. He's got some really interesting arguments.
Okay, break it down for me. What are his main points?
Well, one key area of contention is the idea of abstraction. Aristotle uses this analogy of a geometer studying shapes, comparing it to a biologist studying male and female. His argument is that just as male and female are abstract attributes of animals, so too are points, lines, and planes just abstractions from physical bodies. They don't exist independently.
Okay, so for Aristotle, it's all about deriving these concepts from the physical world.
Right. But Syrianus says, hold on a minute. He argues that you couldn't abstract these mathematical concepts so precisely unless you already had some kind of inbuilt understanding of them. He says the soul possesses the logoi of all things, these underlying rational structures.
Okay, so he's saying that our minds are already equipped with these mathematical principles. It's not just about observation.
Exactly. He thinks geometry is about the soul contemplating these logoi, these perfect partless structures.
Hmm.
But because we're limited in our ability to do pure imageless intellection, we project these logoi onto imagined shapes.
It's like our minds are trying to grasp these perfect concepts, but can only do so through imperfect images.
Right. And he even compares it to the way matter receives form, but with a twist.
Hmm.
Imagination, unlike matter, it retains the mathematical blueprint it receives from the intellect.
So it's a much more active and dynamic view of the mind.
Definitely. And it really gets to the heart of epistemology, you know? How do we know what we know?
Yeah, big questions.
Big questions. And then there's the whole third man argument.
Ah, yes, the classic critique of the theory of forms.
Right. It's this idea that if the form of man is both the perfect essence of humanity and a perfect instance of it, then you need a third man to account for the resemblance between the form and actual men. And then you need a fourth and a fifth and so on. It leads to an infinite regress.
Yeah, it's like a hall of mirrors, but with philosophical concepts.
Exactly. And Syrianus offers a really clever response. He says, look, the word man isn't being used in the same way when we talk about the form of man and an individual man. If it were, then we have to say that the form of man has internal organs and stuff.
Okay, that would be weird.
Right. So he's saying that the predication of man is different in each case. He uses this analogy of a model and its image. The form is like the perfect blueprint, and individual men are like imperfect copies.
So the form is man in the sense that it's the archetype, the source. And individual men are men because they participate in that form, they try to embody it.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important distinction. And then there's the whole debate about Syrianus's originality, especially in relation to the commentary attributed to Peace Alexander.
Oh, yeah, there are some overlaps there, right?
There are. And for a long time, scholars weren't sure who was influencing whom. But now, most scholars think that the Peace Alexander commentary was actually written much later, probably by Michael of Ephesus during the Byzantine Renaissance.
So Syrianus is the original, and Peace Alexander is building on his work.
Right. And finally, we have to talk about Syrianus's commentary on Hermogenes, the rhetorician. It's dedicated to his son, Alexander.
So maybe a little fatherly advice on the art of persuasion?
Perhaps. But this commentary, even though it's not strictly philosophical, it's still really valuable. It's full of references and quotes from all sorts of philosophers, Plato, minor Platonists, Aristotle. It shows us the rich intellectual tapestry of late antiquity.
Like a window into the philosophical conversations of that era.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways about Syrianus?
Yeah, what's the big picture?
Well, I think his role as Plutarch's successor and Proclus's teacher is crucial. He's a key figure in the transmission of Platonism. He keeps that tradition alive.
Right, a bridge between generations of philosophers.
Exactly. And his commentary on the metaphysics, it shows us this fascinating dance between Platonism and Aristotelianism. He's trying to reconcile them in a way, but also defending the core principles of Platonism.
Especially when it comes to mathematics and the forms.
Absolutely. And then, even though we've lost most of his work, the fragments we have, along with the testimonies of others, they give us this glimpse into the intellectual world of late antiquity, a time of huge change and upheaval.
Yeah, it's like we're piecing together a lost world.
And it's important to acknowledge that we don't have the full picture of Syrianus's thought. There's still a lot of room for interpretation and further research.
So, to our listeners out there, we leave you with this thought. Syrianus was trying to bridge different philosophical traditions during a time of huge cultural shifts. How can his approach inspire us today? as we navigate our own complex world of ideas. It's something to ponder.
Absolutely. Food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.